They say land holds memory, that rivers recall footsteps long faded, and mountains echo with the silence of the dead. But what if memory ran deeper, not through stone, but through blood, beneath the snow-capped giants of the Caucasus, long before kings or written words, before even the first myth took breath? There were people, not invaders, not settlers, founders. The first Georgians, though they did not yet call themselves that, walked these valleys over 13,000 years ago. And when we search for them today, we do not have to dig through ruined temples or broken tablets. We can simply listen to the DNA that still sings in the bones of their descendants. From the darkness of Colchis cave, from the cold silence of Serbia, scientists unearthed fragments of skulls. They extracted not just bone dust, but lineage, a distinct signature, a genetic branch unseen anywhere else. Not quite European, not quite Near Eastern, something older, something indigenous. They called it Caucasus Hunter-Gatherer, CHG, a people as wild and unyielding as the mountains that cradled them. And here's the revelation that changed everything. This lineage, preserved in the Georgian genome today, did not simply remain in these hills. It traveled, because thousands of years later, across the Eurasian steppe, a new people emerged, the Yamnaya, horse-born nomads who exploded across Europe, spreading Indo-European languages and changing the continent forever. But when their skeletons were analyzed, scientists found something shocking. Half their DNA came from here, from Georgia. This land, tucked between the Black Sea and the Caspian, had not just absorbed history, it had seeded it. Imagine that, the linguistic foundations of Europe, the genes of Bronze Age warriors, the ancestral code of kings and emperors, all carrying echoes of those first hunter-gatherers who once warmed themselves by the fires of a Svaneti cave. So when we say the Georgian people have been here a long time, it's not poetry, it's not pride, it's biology. Their blood remembers. And perhaps what's most astonishing is not just that CHG ancestry remains, but that it dominates. In modern Georgians, it persists powerfully, woven into the genetic core, not erased by time, not overwritten by war. In a world where most nations are tapestries of erasure and migration, Georgia stands apart. The story written in its blood is not one of replacement. It is one of resilience. In the silence of Paleolithic Georgia, before even the shadow of the first temple, a child left a footprint in the soft cave soil. No one remembers her name. No epic was written in her honor. Yet her DNA lives on, in millions. Long before borders carved the map, before the words Europe or Asia had meaning, there existed a people who had no neighbor, only wilderness. They hunted along riverbanks now lost to time. They sheltered in caves as glaciers melted. They were the earliest humans to call the Caucasus home. And when scientists peered into their bones, they didn't find just old genes. They found something unique. What the world came to know as Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers, or CHG, was not merely another primitive population. This was a branch of humanity that split off tens of thousands of years ago. Neither Western European nor Near Eastern. Their genetic profile stood alone, as if the mountains themselves had preserved a lineage the rest of the world forgot. And forgotten they were, until the 21st century, when ancient remains were recovered from the Serbia and Colchis caves. Researchers made a discovery that sent tremors through the study of human origins. These individuals carried genetic markers so distinct, they forced science to redraw the family tree of Eurasia. CHG weren't just ancestors of modern Georgians. They were a foundation population, a silent architect of future civilizations. And most remarkably, their blood didn't stay confined to the Caucasus. Because centuries later, far to the north, the steppe began to stir. The rise of the Yamnaya, the powerful horse-riding culture often credited with shaping the genetic and linguistic future of Europe, was always believed to have sprung from the grasslands. But genomic sequencing told a deeper truth. Half of their ancestry came from the Caucasus. Not from conquest, not from trade, from union. The mixing of CHG with Eastern European hunter-gatherers birthed a new people, mobile, resilient, dominant. When the Yamnaya surged westward, carrying what would become Indo-European languages, they carried Caucasus DNA in their veins, which means, in the genetic architecture of modern Europeans, from the Irish coast to the Balkans, There lies a hidden thread spun from the highlands of ancient Georgia. Yet what makes this more than a historical footnote is this. The CHG lineage never vanished. In Georgia it persisted, where other populations were diluted, overwritten by wave after wave of migration. The Georgians held fast. Deep within their genetic code, the signature of the forgotten founders remained strong, active, central. Even now, it accounts for a significant portion of modern Georgian ancestry. This isn't just continuity. It's something far rarer, ancestral dominance without political conquest. The geography helped. The Caucasus Mountains, with their sheer cliffs and isolated valleys, created natural refuges. Here, in places like Svaneti, bloodlines could persist across millennia with minimal interruption. And while the rest of the ancient world reshaped itself through empire and war, the people of Georgia absorbed change without losing origin. That's why, when we speak of the Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers, we are not talking about a dead culture or an extinct genome. We are talking about living descendants. Their faces walk among us. Their silence fills the genetic maps we now use to trace the birth of civilizations. And in this silence, a truth emerges. The story of human history is often told through the lens of migration and replacement. But Georgia offers a different narrative, one where the earliest inhabitants never truly left. They endured, not through conquest or domination, but through uninterrupted existence. Not many populations can claim that. 6,000 years before the birth of Christ, the highlands of Georgia met strangers. They came not with weapons, but with seeds. From the fertile arc of Anatolia and the Levant, waves of early farmers crossed into the Caucasus, bringing with them more than just agriculture. They brought an entirely new genetic legacy. And yet, what happened next was not a replacement, not an erasure. It was a merging of worlds. The Neolithic Revolution, often described as a transformation of landscape and livelihood, in Georgia became something far more intimate, a biological negotiation between ancient residents and southern newcomers. The indigenous hunter-gatherers, whose blood had run in these mountains since the end of the Ice Age, did not vanish. Instead, they blended. And from that fusion, something profoundly unique was born. This wasn't just the dawn of farming in the Caucasus. It was the creation of a new genetic people, one shaped by the rugged memory of the North and the cultivated precision of the South. The early farmers who entered Georgia carried ancestry from Anatolia. But when they settled, their children were no longer purely Anatolian. They became Caucasian Neolithic hybrids, carriers of both agricultural knowledge and deep local memory. We see this in the bones. Ancient DNA taken from the Chalcolithic layers of Georgia shows an increasing frequency of lineages tied to early farming cultures, especially maternal lines that trace to the Fertile Crescent. Yet side by side, male lines remain tied to the highland soil, enduring Y-DNA signatures that had weathered thousands of years of isolation. This wasn't migration as invasion, it was migration as marriage. The Kura-Araxes culture emerged from this convergence. Centered in what is now eastern Georgia, it marked one of the earliest societies in human history where metallurgy, domestication, and trade networks flourished, not in the shadow of empire, but in autonomous highland settlements. From the banks of the Kura River, this culture spread like wildfire across the Armenian highlands, northern Iran, and the Levant. But it wasn't just pots and tools they carried. They carried DNA. They carried ancestry. They carried the blended identity of the South Caucasus into regions that had never seen it before. And perhaps most remarkable, they brought it back as well, because the mountains of Georgia were never hermetically sealed. Over time, genetic traffic flowed in both directions. From the steppes above and from Mesopotamia below, new people came. But each time, the story repeated. Assimilation, not destruction. The Caucasus did not become someone else's province. It became their crucible. In fact, recent genetic studies show that during this very Neolithic to Bronze Age window, Georgian populations became more complex, not less. Instead of being overridden, their genetic identity began to resemble a kind of layered manuscript. Ancient CHG roots still intact, but interlaced now with southern fertility and eastern rhythm. This is where Georgia became more than a crossroads. It became a biological bridge. The Neolithic arrival didn't just alter diets or dwelling patterns. It permanently rewrote The story of inheritance, in mitochondria, in chromosomes, in the very structure of the modern Georgian genome. And in this fusion lies a subtle but powerful lesson, that legacy is not always forged through conquest. Sometimes it is shaped through coexistence, through fields sown together, children born of different winds, and cultures that find strength in synthesis, not submission. Long before maps bore the name Georgia, the land echoed with the weight of two rising kingdoms, one cradled by the Black Sea, the other nestled in the mountain valleys of the east. Colchis and Iberia, two ancient thrones, one western, one eastern, and in their bloodlines the echoes of civilizations far older than their crowns. To the outsider, these kingdoms appear as lines in forgotten chronicles. To geneticists, they're living archives, not etched in stone, but carried in the cells of their descendants. In the west, Colchis thrived where rivers cut through lush forests and gold sparkled beneath the mountain soil. The legends would later call it the land of the Golden Fleece, but the truth is more enduring than myth. Here, among the Mingrillian people, DNA has preserved the memory of a Bronze Age population remarkably untouched by time. Genetic studies show that their lineage stabilized over 4,000 years ago, anchoring itself in a blend of ancestral threads that became distinctively Georgian long before the word existed. One thread runs deeper than the rest, a paternal marker, haplogroup G2A, found across Georgia, but nowhere more prominently than in the highlands. Among the Svans, its presence is overwhelming, not as a coincidence, but as a relic of ancient male lines that resisted dilution through isolation, generation after generation. These aren't abstract haplogroups. They're family trees with roots sunk into millennia of soil, whispered down through silence rather than surnames. On the eastern side of the mountains, Iberia took shape amid trade routes and shifting empires. A kingdom that would be among the first in the region to embrace Christianity, but whose genetic makeup remained tethered to a much older identity. Archaeogenetic findings show a steady increase in southern ancestry, DNA from Anatolia and the Levant slowly weaving into the tapestry. But it didn't overwrite the core. It enriched it, because both kingdoms, Colchis with its metallurgists, Iberia with its warrior priests, evolved not through the loss of genetic heritage, but through its accumulation. Even as armies passed through their lands, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the people of Georgia held on to their biological continuity. In the cemeteries of their cities and the ossuaries of their highlands, we don't see a reset. We see a thread stretched across time. The distinction between Colchis and Iberia wasn't only political. It was also genetic. While western Georgia retained deeper levels of Caucasus Hunter-Gatherer ancestry and subtle influences from west, eastern Georgia shows markers of interaction with the Near East and, to a limited extent, steppe-related groups. And yet, even with these differences, the underlying structure remains astonishingly unified. This is perhaps Georgia's most underappreciated truth. Its regions developed distinct faces, but shared the same bones. There are few places in the world where ancient political borders align so cleanly with patterns in Y chromosome variation. The Svans' dominance of G2A, the Mingrillians' notable levels of haplogroup L, the eastern prevalence of J2, a lineage shaped in Mesopotamia and carried into Iberia through centuries of southbound migration. Each of these markers is a genetic footnote to a historical chapter, a way of reading the past through inheritance rather than inscription. And while the kingdoms themselves would rise and fall, while their names would fade from coins and scrolls, the people endured. Not metaphorically, literally. The DNA of the modern Georgian carries the imprint of the Colchian metallurgist, the Iberian horseman, the mother who walked between mountain shrine and valley vineyard. This legacy isn't static. It's breathing. It lives in the linguistic diversity that splits west from east. It lives in the shared resilience that kept those kingdoms intact despite the tectonic pressure of empire. It lives in the child born today in Zugdidi or Tel Aviv, who unknowingly bears the genetic crown of two ancient worlds. From the open grasslands north of the Caucasus, a storm began to rise, not of clouds or rain, but of riders. Wave after wave of mounted tribes emerged from the steppe, carrying with them the power to reshape continents, rewrite languages, and reorder the very blueprint of civilization. And yet, when these northern winds reached Georgia, something different happened. They arrived. They mingled. But they did not rule the blood. The story of steppe migrations is often told as one of dominance, Indo-European languages, washing over the West like fire, driven by cultures like the Yamnaya and later the Scythians. Their arrival across Europe left an unmistakable signature, a steep rise in steppe ancestry, especially in paternal lines. But Georgia tells a quieter tale. When the Bronze Age was unfolding, the first steppe-connected haplogroups began appearing in the southern Caucasus. Among them, a key lineage, R1BZ2103, a branch associated with pastoralist elites who crossed the rivers of the Pontic-Caspian frontier. In much of Europe, this marker would come to dominate. But here, in the valleys and highlands of Georgia, it took its place in a crowd. Never a conqueror, always a contributor. The dominant paternal lineages of Georgia remained anchored in older foundations. G2A-J2, ancestral signals, with deep roots in the Neolithic and even earlier. Even in regions like Kartli and Kakheti, where steppe input was most detectable, the genetic core refused to be displaced. And it wasn't just the Y chromosome that spoke. Across the genome, steppe-related ancestry entered the Georgian gene pool not as a flood, but as a slow, steady stream. Ancient DNA samples from the Middle Bronze Age show evidence of this input, a trickle of genes connected to Eastern European hunter-gatherers. But this influence peaked early, and then began to recede. By the Iron Age, Georgia was already differentiating itself from regions like Armenia, where steppe influence continued to rise. The people of Iberia, Eastern Georgia's ancient kingdom, accepted fragments of the steppe, but retained their distinctiveness. Their language, Kartvelian, remained untouched by the linguistic tide that swept so many others into Indo-European phonetics. Even their material culture reflected this resistance. The tools, burial styles, and ceramics of Georgia's late Bronze Age show only selective borrowing from steppe cultures, no wholesale replacement, no identity collapse. But the northern winds didn't stop blowing. In later centuries, the Scythians, Sarmatians, and Alans would cross through Georgia, leaving both footprints and fragments of DNA. Nomadic empires surged and fell, from the Huns to the Khazars, riding the same winds that once carried the Yamnaya. And yet, in Georgia, these waves left only ripples. Genetic outliers appear in specific periods, especially the early medieval. Individuals with distinct steppe ancestry or cultural signatures, like artificial cranial deformation, a custom associated with nomadic elites. But even these cases are often local Georgians adopting foreign practices, not outsiders replacing populations. What we see in the DNA is not invasion, but interruption, brief moments of contact and intermarriage, not systemic transformation. The Georgian genome absorbed what it encountered, but never surrendered its origin. That's the quiet power of the Caucasus. Its mountains didn't just shelter bloodlines. They gave them time to hold their shape. The geography slowed the advance of external forces just enough to allow identity to persist, evolve, and absorb on its own terms. And so, while the steppe reshaped Europe's population maps and gave birth to new tongues, in Georgia, it added only a new verse to an already ancient song. History often follows the swords of men. It maps their battles, their migrations, their conquests. But beneath the noise of empire and invasion lies a softer current, one carried in the quiet continuity of mothers. If Y chromosomes record the paths of fathers, then mitochondrial DNA preserves the legacy of women, not through flags or kingdoms, but through the unbroken line from daughter to daughter, mother to child. And in Georgia, that legacy is both ancient and astonishingly diverse. When researchers examined the maternal heritage of the Georgian people, they found no single origin, no dominant lineage. Instead, what emerged was a mosaic of haplogroups, each a whisper from a different time and place. Among the most frequent were H, K, U, T, and W, clades with roots stretching across West Eurasia, some tracing back to the earliest days of agriculture, others even older. In the western lowlands, among the Mingrelians, this diversity was especially pronounced. The maternal lineages reflected centuries of connectivity to Anatolia, to the Balkans, to the Near East, but not in a way that diluted the Georgian identity. Rather, it painted a picture of female mobility that spanned millennia, even while paternal lines remained more regionally fixed. In the highlands, where communities like the Svans carved out isolated lives in stone villages above the clouds, the story became more intriguing. Despite their geographic seclusion, Svan women carried an unexpectedly rich variety of mtDNA haplogroups. Some of these lineages, such as X2 or U4b, hinted at prehistoric movements from Europe or Central Asia, their footprints embedded not in language or toolkits, but in cellular memory. This contrast between isolated mountains and genetic openness suggests something profound. While men may have remained anchored to ancestral valleys, women moved. They arrived through marriage, migration, alliance, and each arrival brought not just a new face, but a new strand in the maternal thread. Even more striking is the occasional presence of East Eurasian mtDNA in Georgian populations. Haplogroups like A, C, D, and F, typically associated with Siberian or Central Asian origins, appear sporadically, particularly in groups like the Mingrelians. These aren't signs of conquest. They're the faint echoes of long-distance connections, perhaps formed during medieval trade, or through encounters with Turkic or Alanic nomads who passed through the Caucasus centuries ago. And yet, despite all this variety, the maternal genetic landscape of Georgia never fractured. The mtDNA of Georgians remains cohesive, bound not by sameness, but by endurance. It reflects a region that has always stood at the intersection of movement, absorbing new life without losing its foundation. This legacy is made even more powerful by its subtlety. There are no monuments to these mothers, no epic poems, but their story is written in every heartbeat, every family line, every modern Georgian who carries within them an unbroken link to women who lived, loved, and bore children in the shadows of mountains long before written history began. In their bodies, memory has outlived architecture. And in their mitochondria, we find the hidden cartography of the Caucasus, not in empires, but in generations. Across the timeline of Georgia, the horizon has never been quiet for long. From the north came warriors with bronze spears. From the south, priests and scribes. From the east, riders cloaked in empire. Each arrived with a vision of conquest. Each believed they could change the land and the people. But the land had its own memory. And the people, they had endurance etched into their bones. The Caucasus was never a fortress sealed from the world. It was a corridor, a threshold between great civilizations. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, they all passed through its valleys, some staying, some fading. Later came Arab generals, Turkic confederations, Mongol raiders, and imperial armies wearing Russian crests. But when we look into the DNA of modern Georgians, we do not find the expected scars of total collapse or replacement. We find threads of influence, yes, but not disruption. In the genetic record, there's no sign of a moment when the old lineages were uprooted and discarded. Instead, there's a persistence, a quiet continuity that runs like a hidden river beneath centuries of upheaval. Georgia absorbed, but it did not surrender. Take the Arab Caliphate, which once controlled parts of the East Caucasus with iron discipline. Their policies of settlement and assimilation are well documented in history. But in Georgian genomes, the impact is faint. A touch of southwestern ancestry here. A few maternal lineages with distant desert roots, but no deep restructuring. The mountain communities, especially, remained largely untouched. The language, the customs, and the core bloodlines held. Then there were the Turkic migrations. The Seljuks, later the Ottomans, swept through the region with the force of a tidal wave. Yet even they, with all their power, made only shallow impressions on Georgia's genetic soil. Haplogroups common among Turkic populations, like certain branches of East Eurasian origin, appear, but only in isolated pockets and minor frequencies. The dominant lineages, both paternal and maternal, remained rooted in earlier epochs. And what of the Mongols, whose name alone evokes visions of extinction and submission? Their horses crossed Georgian rivers. Their banners flew over Georgian towns. But when scientists sequenced ancient remains from the late medieval period, they found something surprising. Even when steppe ancestry was present, it often came embedded in individuals who were otherwise local, suggesting that rather than mass displacement, the effect was more subtle. Intermarriage, assimilation, cultural borrowing. One of the most haunting traces of this period lies not in genes, but in skulls. In burials from early medieval Georgia, elongated crania appear, shaped intentionally through head binding, a custom associated with steppe nomads like the Huns and Alans. And yet, many of these individuals show no foreign ancestry. They were Georgians, genetically native, who had adopted an external practice without being genetically replaced. This reveals something essential about the nature of resilience. Survival is not always resistance. Sometimes it is adaptation without absorption. Sometimes it is the ability to take in the world's noise and still preserve the melody of your own origin. Not all traces were so soft. During the migration period, genetic data shows a measurable increase in diversity, particularly in urban centers, where the movement of traders, soldiers, and settlers was highest. But the countryside, the hills, the forests, the alpine villages, acted as a genetic vault. Lineages already ancient by the Bronze Age continued there, uninterrupted, like lit candles passed hand to hand through a storm. The result of all these intrusions was not a fractured identity, but a layered one. Georgia's gene pool expanded, but did not dissolve. It remembered who it was, even as it adapted to the world. Today, when we examine the DNA of modern Georgians, we see whispers from the east and west, fragments of empires long vanished. But they appear like notes in the margin, not a new text, just additional ink. The body of the story remains the same. To outsiders, Georgia is often seen as a single story, one flag, one language family, one ancient mountain people. But inside its borders, the truth is more intricate. Every valley holds a dialect. Every mountain pass holds a difference. And beneath that cultural texture lies something even older, a subtle, quiet genetic mosaic. This isn't a country where populations blended into a uniform whole. It's a place where diversity rooted itself in geography, carving out micro-identities that, while part of a larger whole, still reflect unique genetic footprints. In the Northwest, the Svans have lived in the highlands of Svaneti for millennia. Isolated by peaks, protected by snow, they became guardians of an ancient genetic thread. Among them, one paternal lineage rises above all others, G2A. It doesn't just occur, it dominates. This is more than frequency. It's heritage in high concentration, likely the result of small founder populations and generations of limited gene flow. Their ancestors didn't migrate far. They didn't need to. The mountains gave them permanence. But move eastward, and the pattern begins to shift. In Kakheti and the neighboring regions, Y-chromosome lineages begin to diversify. Haplogroups like J2 take on greater prominence, hinting at deeper contact with southern neighbors, Iran, Mesopotamia, and the broader Fertile Crescent. These eastern areas were less isolated. Trade routes, religious centers, and political crossings made them more permeable, and their genomes reflect that openness. Then there are the Mingrillians of the West, linguistically distinct, historically tied to the legacy of Colchis. Their genetics tell a story of continuity, but not uniformity. Among them, we find a curious signal. Haplogroup L1b, rare in most of the Caucasus, appears with a steady pulse. It whispers of ancient ties to the Iranian Plateau or South Asia, possibly arriving during the early Bronze Age, and preserved through localized inheritance. What's striking is that these variations don't fracture identity. They enrich it. While populations elsewhere show homogenization through time, the erasure of regional difference, Georgia retained its internal complexity. Genetic drift, cultural endogamy, and geography work together like artisans, shaping each subgroup with a distinct edge while keeping the stone whole. In fact, modern genome-wide studies reveal something fascinating. Georgians across different regions are more genetically similar to each other than to any neighboring group. And yet, within that unity, there are detectable patterns. Western Georgians cluster slightly differently from Eastern ones. Highlanders bear markers that differ subtly from those of lowland populations. The Svans, the Laz, the Tush, all carry echoes of distinct pasts, but walk in the same present. And in some places, language, genetics, and culture move in different directions altogether. The Abkhaz, for example, speak a completely different language family than the Kartvelian groups. Yet genetically, they share significant overlap. This shows that in the Caucasus, Shared ancestry often survives linguistic divergence, a reminder that language and blood do not always travel hand in hand. These details matter because they challenge the idea that genetic history is a single arc. Georgia's history is not one path. It's a network of trails, winding through forests and over cliffs, through dynasties and dialects. Every region, every group, kept its own rhythm, and the genome remembers that rhythm even now. The real power of Georgia's genetic story lies not in its unity alone, but in its ability to contain complexity without losing cohesion. It is a nation that did not erase its inner diversity to stand together. Instead, it protected it. Like stone towers guarding the valleys they rise from, there are places in the world where history happens, and then there are places where history converges. Georgia is not merely an ancient land. It is a geographical conversation, a terrain that has listened to the voices of empires, carried the footsteps of shepherds and kings, and stitched together strands of ancestry from every direction on the compass. But its significance isn't just political or cultural. It's biological. Genetically, Georgia occupies a position of extraordinary balance, not at the edge of Eurasia, but at its center of exchange. Modern genomic analyses place Georgian populations in a position that defies simplicity. When mapped on principal component analyses, those scientific visualizations of genetic distance, Georgians fall between Europe and West Asia, not leaning fully into either. Instead, they sit in a genetic corridor connecting the Balkans, Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, and the steppes to the north. But what's remarkable is not just the position, it's the depth of contribution. Long before the borders of nations took shape, Georgian DNA was already part of stories happening far beyond its own mountains. The Caucasus Hunter-Gatherer component, native to this region, became a foundational layer in the genetic structure of the Yamnaya pastoralists, who would go on to spread across much of Europe and South Asia. This means that Georgian ancestry isn't just local. It helped sculpt the Pan-Eurasian genome. Later, as Neolithic farmers pushed up from the Levant and Anatolia, Georgia absorbed their genes, and in time, re-exported that ancestry through cultures like Kura-Araxes, which left archaeological and genetic footprints stretching into the Near East and even parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. This two-way movement, ancestry flowing in and ancestry flowing out, continued across the Bronze and Iron Ages. At every phase, Georgia served not as a cul-de-sac of heritage, but as a gateway. Even in recent centuries, we see this same pattern. Low-level East Eurasian components appear in modern Georgian DNA, likely remnants of Silk Road-era contact, Turkic movements, or transient groups like the Alans and Mongols. These elements do not dominate, but they linger like distant notes in a complex chord, enhancing, not replacing, the melody of native ancestry. This interconnectedness is also visible in specific genetic markers. Certain subclades of haplogroup J2, for example, appear both in Georgia and in distant parts of the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau, tracing commercial and cultural threads that tied cities and caravans together long before written treaties ever did. Even minor signals from South Asian or Levantine haplogroups point to ancient interactions, marriages, trades, or pilgrimages that never made it into the chronicles, but live on in chromosomes. And yet, Georgia never dissolved into the currents it hosted. It remained distinctly itself. That is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of its place in the Eurasian web. It connected others without losing internal cohesion. Where many crossroads societies lost their native languages, cultures, and even people to the tides of migration, Georgia retained its Kartvelian linguistic core, its indigenous social systems, and its deep genetic signature. It acted like a sponge and a prism at once, absorbing the world's movements, refracting them into something uniquely its own. Today, when a Georgian takes a DNA test, the results may show echoes from a dozen directions. West Asian ancestry, European fragments, steppe influences, traces of the Levant, or even distant Central Asia. But the central structure always circles back to the Caucasus, to an identity forged through interconnection, not isolation. Georgia is not a borderland. It is a bridge, not a survivor of foreign waves, but a carrier of ancestral ripples. In a world that often seeks purity in origins, Georgia offers a more powerful truth. Legacy thrives not in separation, but in synthesis. Belonging is not a shape. It's not a border traced on a map, or a word printed in a passport. It's something older, deeper, something that hums beneath your skin when the wind smells like memory, and a place feels familiar without reason. For Georgians, that sense isn't imagined. It's inherited. When a person walks the stone streets of Mskita or stands at the threshold of a Venetian tower, they're not just standing on history. They're standing inside it. The very molecules in their cells carry instructions from ancestors who looked at the same sky, touched the same soil, and survived the same winters. What does it mean to belong somewhere for 13,000 years? It means the blood flowing through your veins once pulsed in the bodies of those who lit fires in Paleolithic caves, who carved symbols into bone before alphabets existed. It means your mitochondrial legacy was passed silently from mother to daughter through invasions, plagues, and empires, never breaking, never losing its voice. It means your Y chromosome, if you carry one, might trace directly to the blacksmiths of the Kura-Araxes, or the priests of Colchis, or the farmers who coaxed wheat from the mountain clay when the rest of the world still wandered. But it also means this: belonging isn't static. It isn't a fossil. It's something alive, something that breathes through contradiction. Because to belong in Georgia is to carry not just one story, but a braid of them: steppe echoes, Anatolian sparks, Mediterranean winds, Eastern whispers. And yet, through all this, a singular identity remains. Not a purity, a continuity. We live in an age obsessed with origin. DNA tests promise to reveal who we truly are. But in Georgia, the truth has never needed rediscovery. It has never left. It sits in lullabies sung in Kartvelian dialects that no empire could erase. It's embedded in rituals older than any crown. And it radiates from a genome that has refused, generation after generation, to vanish under someone else's shadow. To belong here isn't just about heritage. It's about inheritance, of memory, of survival, of silence held sacred for millennia. Maybe that's why, even in exile, Georgians never forget where they come from. Because the homeland isn't just a place on earth. It's a pattern inside the body. A script that rewrites itself in every child, carrying forward the whispers of those who never got a statue, never saw their names recorded, but who lived and loved and left something behind. So what does it mean to belong? It means that when your story is told, it doesn't begin with you. It began long before, in the bones of strangers who are now your roots, in a land that did not simply hold them, but became them. And now, it's your turn to carry that story forward, not as a chapter, but as a living verse,